Good evening. I'm Daniel Gill with Allergan, and Allergan, along with the School of Biological Sciences here at UCI and the Center for Autism Research and Translation and the Center for Autism and Neurodevelopmental Disorders are proud to present this evening's lecture. It is part of the Allergan lecture series in modern biology, and which is a continuing series of lectures we have here at UCI at the Beckman Center to really talk about how research in biology relates to our daily lives and very often diseases that we face in our daily lives. My job, as always, is to present my partner here in the School of Biological Sciences, and I think I know that I've been doing this for a while because I'm now on my third dean of the School of Biological Sciences. So, but it gives me great honor to introduce tonight Frank LaFerla, who was just, as of January, named the new dean of the school. He is the Hannah and Francisco J. Ayala Dean, and it says here you began on January 2nd. And Frank, in his own right, is a terrific researcher. He is one of the leading researchers in the world on Alzheimer's disease. And one of these days we're going to have you come and talk about that. But without further ado, Frank's going to come up and introduce tonight's speaker.
So thank you. It's a great honor to be here. And my first job is to really thank Dan Gill and the wonderful folks at Allergan for being such tremendous partners for the School of Biological Sciences. So thank you very much. So I think this might have been a program that Sue Bryant actually started when she was dean many years ago. And I actually gave one of these lecture series probably, 8 years ago, 9 years ago? It's been so long I don't even remember. But I also want to take the time to thank the co-sponsors, which are CAN and CART as well, for helping to put such a wonderful agenda together. And also to thank the wonderful staff in the Dean's office, Brian Carlson in particular, who's hiding up there in the back, for doing a wonderful job of coordinating this, and also Michael Leon for his work in putting this wonderful program together. So thank you all. And I have the distinct honor of introducing tonight's speaker, Dr. Connie Kasari, who we actually were able to get to do double duty today because during the scientific symposium, one of our speakers called out sick, and I think Michael called up there, and she was really gracious and braved the 405 and came down very quickly to give one of the lectures, so we really appreciate that. And she has been actively involved in autism research for over 25 years. As you can see on the slide here, she's from UCLA, which she has been since 1990, and she's a professor there of human development and psychology, and also happens to have a joint appointment in the psychiatry department. She is a founding member of UCLA's Center for Autism Research and Treatment, and she's led many NIH-related programs on this topic. She has done really, truly spectacular research. She gave a wonderful talk this afternoon, has great videos, which I think you'll really enjoy seeing, a very long list of publications, and I could go on and on about her research career and her accomplishments, but I think it'd be important to really welcome her to the stage where she's going to talk about social communication, school-based interventions for children with ASD. So let's welcome her here.
Okay, good evening. Okay, so I apologize to anyone who was here earlier if I repeat some of the videos, but hopefully I'm going to talk a little bit more broadly tonight about school-based interventions. So how many parents are here of children with autism? Okay, your kids are in school, right? So we'll talk a little bit about schools, and I assume other people are mostly researchers. clinicians in the community, maybe? Yeah, okay. Okay, so let's see. I thought we would talk first about schools as just a setting for ASD-specific interventions. Then I'll talk a little bit about some current research, both the promises and the limitations of that research, and give some examples from my own program of research. And then I want to think about next steps and kind of thinking outside the box, if we can. So, autism in schools. So now we know there are 1 in 68 children on the spectrum, and there may be more. There's incredible heterogeneity. So over half of the children have average or above average intellectual abilities, and most people believe it's much higher than that, right? So, but in terms of testing, children are clearly, there are more children who are high functioning than children who are struggling intellectually. So about 30% of children, though, remain minimally verbal, despite having access to our best interventions early on. And so we need to understand those children a little bit better. And there's also a lot of heterogeneity in the ability to integrate or to succeed in the school setting. Schools also vary. You know that if you have children in schools. So we'll talk a little bit about that. So why school-based interventions? Well, there are a lot of promises for doing this work in schools. This is where kids spend the most time, right? Other than being in homes, in the home, the adults in school know your child or should know your child better than anyone else other than family. And then the increase that we've had over the past few years in early intervention access and the success of early intervention means that we have many more children who are capable of just going into the general education classroom. Or if not in the general ed classroom, in a special ed classroom within a typical school. All right, so we do know that with early intervention, more kids are going into general ed programs, actually even sort of not aging out, but ability out of ASD criteria. More children are able to communicate by school age. We have a goal of 90% of children being able to use spoken language. We're not quite there, but we're getting closer. And families get a lot of support from early intervention so that they're better able to advocate for their child. So while early intervention is mostly effective, we're not equally effective with all children. We don't yet have all the answers. We can't say we know which children are going to benefit from which kind of intervention more than others. And we're not supporting children in schools to the extent that we should, so that all children are put on a positive developmental trajectory, and that's a problem. So what can we do? So as I'm a researcher, although I do mostly clinical research, so what can we do about this particular issue? So one is that we really need to focus in on the core deficits of social communication in treatment and in outcome measures. And we need to have this movement, I think, away from studying comprehensive packages to thinking more about modular and targeted interventions. Now, that being said, I'm not saying that children don't need a comprehensive intervention. They do. But what we need to do a better job of is understanding which components should go together for which children. And we need to start to think about those active ingredients of treatment, which we've done in other disorders, but we haven't done as much in the field of autism. So when you think about active ingredients, we think about things like dose. So how many hours does it really take for this child to be on a positive trajectory? What approach should we be using, right? You hear mostly about approach in the literature or in the media. So that's the how-to. What kinds of strategies? What approach should we use? And we talk much less about the content. What should we be working on? What should we be teaching? All right, so I think one thing we have to think about is really thinking about meaningful outcomes. So current studies, research studies, focus on IQ as an outcome. But IQ is not a core deficit of autism. We have many high IQ children who have really significant issues in social impairment. Or we have really high IQ children, but they can't use spoken language. So IQ is not the problem, the main problem. We have other areas of the disorder that would be considered the core impairment. So we think about things with young children: shared attention and affect, joint attention. Do you know what joint attention is? So joint attention is what, I explained this earlier today, so I apologize if I give the same examples. So joint attention is a pre-linguistic skill that develops in babies, essentially from about 8 to 14 months. And it's when the baby comes to you and shows you something, points out something, to share attention. So it could be that the child sees a dog and loves dogs and points to the dog and wants to see the dog and is sharing that experience with you. So they might point to the dog, look back to you, point to the dog, and usually there's positive affect associated. So it's as if to say, wow, do you see what I see? And you're just sharing that experience. It's the child who brings you their work and shows it to you. So our kids don't do that very much. And yet we know that children who do more of those kinds of skills actually have better spoken language skills. That's true in typical development, in development of developmentally delayed children. So it's a pretty good index of a skill that children need. And it's a core deficit in children with autism. So it's what distinguishes children with autism early on from other children. Social play with others is another critical area that we need to focus on. And then, of course, developing reciprocal conversations as kids get older. So I want to focus on two different areas in my research program. One is more recent work where we're really focusing on this 30% of kids that are minimally verbal by the time they get to school. And then the second area is really thinking about social skills interventions at school. And these are for more verbal children who are in general education classrooms. So remember, 30% or so are minimally verbal, and the rest of children are really able to go into a general ed class. Now, whether or not they are succeeding there is another issue. So let's start off with talking about minimally verbal kids. So what does it mean to be minimally verbal? So it's unclear how many children we have. It depends on how you define it. In the United States, it's probably around 30%. I go to a lot of developing countries, and almost every child I see is minimally verbal. They've not had any access to early intervention, and it's shocking. So it's clear, though, that most children are not really nonverbal, right? They have words. They often will use them for requesting. So they'll request help. They'll request food, things like that. And sometimes they'll use scripted phrases. So I want is a scripted phrase that's often taught. But also they'll get scripts from, TV programs or favorite cartoons. They may not use language functionally, even if they have language, or they may be very quiet. They may not talk very much at all, although they can talk. And then some children, but probably a very small percentage, seem unable to make sounds. So we talk about apraxia, although that's controversial in autism. And if a child can't make sounds, you actually can't test for apraxia. So it makes it very difficult. So one approach to teaching language or spoken communication to minimally verbal children is to really focus on those developmentally earlier pre-linguistic skills: joint attention, social play. We know that those skills are important to later language. So years ago, like in the late 90s, I did a first study where we looked at a module, so a targeted intervention, wondering if could we teach children joint attention skills, or could we teach them imaginative play? And while that sounds, well, of course, you would try that, there really weren't curriculums for teaching these kind of skills because we don't teach these skills. Kids just develop these skills, right? You never taught, if you have a typical child at home, you never taught them to point, right? Or to talk even, they just do. So we did a study where we were interested in teaching joint attention initiations, because it's the initiating of the point or the show, not necessarily the responding, that is more impaired. And what we found was that we could improve joint attention initiations, so you get what you teach, essentially. And we could also improve social play if we taught those skills. But what was more important was that those kinds of skills actually resulted in greater language outcomes. So in this graph, time 1 to time 2 is only 6 weeks about, and time 4 is a year later. So what we're trying to do is predict from a very dense short-term intervention on teaching joint attention to whether or not that has an effect on language a year later. And the effect is about 15 to 17 months language gain in the experimental group compared to a control group of kids who improved 7.5 months. Now, all of these kids were getting 30 hours per week of ABA. So it wasn't like they weren't getting any interventions. But at that time, in the late 90s, we weren't really focusing behavioral interventions on these particular core deficits. So just adding in the content made a difference. So we've done, several randomized controlled trials. They're published studies. You can look them up if you're interested on teaching joint attention and play. So what I want to focus in now are on a couple of videos just to describe what I'm talking about. So when we talk about symbolic play, right? So symbolic play is imaginative play. It's pretending like something is something that it's not, right? The block is a hat. Or that, the tea kettle is pouring water, but there's no water. All right, so using some imagination. So how do we teach that? So the most common approach used with children with autism in California, when people want ABA, how many of you are getting ABA for your children? Most people. And most people want discrete trial training, which is a particular type of ABA, right? They're not exactly the same thing. So when people teach a child symbolic play using discrete trial training, which is a very repetitive drilled type intervention, this is what it looks like. Okay, so there are differences between preverbal, what we consider preverbal kids, and who we consider to be minimally verbal. So preschool children should all be preverbal, right? They're not talking yet, but they will talk. That should be our expectation. And they become minimally verbal if they're still not using a lot of spoken language by the time they enter kindergarten, right? So that's the point at which we need to start thinking about doing something different. Although one could think about doing something different earlier, we just don't know exactly when that is. Okay, so we've also done a study. So this is a newer study where we've looked at minimally verbal school-age children. So these are children between the ages of 5 and 8 years old, so entering school, who really have fewer than 20 words that are functional, so they would be considered minimally verbal. And what we're learning about kids like this is that we need to provide access to communication. Now, we can do this earlier as well, but in this case, this is a child who had no words at all in the beginning, and so needed a speech-generating device in order to communicate. So what we know from a study that we did on about 61 kids that were minimally verbal, it was a multi-site study, was that children who got randomized to receiving a speech-generating device in addition to the behavioral intervention actually increased the number of socially communicative utterances, words, more so than children who just got the behavioral intervention. So all we're doing is comparing whether or not the access to another communication device made a difference. Right? Randomized. So we didn't decide that somebody needed it or didn't need it. We just randomized them to get it or not get it. And so that was a fairly significant finding, and that paper's in press. So you can read about the details if you're interested. But one thing we have to think about is how early to provide an iPad, which we're using more now that we've got more control over the software, to children that are young. So in this case, we have a 4-year-old, minimally verbal, who has an iPad. And let me see if I can show you. This is another little guy that just didn't open his mouth, really. He didn't have words, and he was 4. But he's another smart little guy. All right, so this is our new design, which is thinking about a sequence. So thinking about using discrete trial training or using this module that we've developed, Jasper. So we randomize kids to one treatment or the other, and then we check for what their response to the treatment is in 6 weeks. And those children who are fast responders get re-randomized to get parent training or not. And if you're a slow responder, you either stay the course because you need more time, or you get a rescue protocol, which is a combination of the two protocols. So we're not really comparing DTT to Jasper. We're comparing the sequence of treatments because kids need both, right? They need either more structure in their intervention or they need more naturalistic strategies combined with the behavioral strategies, right? Depending on what it is that you're teaching and what their response is. And so these kinds of designs are kind of the new wave of intervention research, where we're trying to really think about tailoring a treatment to the individual child. And so stay tuned. We'll have that done in probably 4 more years. And another way that we've taken this early intervention work is to deploy it to teachers. So we're working with preschoolers in LAUSD. And then we also have a site in New York City with 120 kids in the Bronx and in Harlem. So in all these cases, the kids are under-resourced, and we're trying to teach teachers how to incorporate Jasper into a module or a center at the school. All right, and we have, materials for teachers so that we can teach them. Now, let's switch gears and talk about another area, which is when children are high-functioning verbal and able to go into a general education classroom. So this is really interesting work because, again, we have this incredible heterogeneity. So while we have heterogeneity across the whole spectrum of autism, and there's huge heterogeneity even if you're minimally verbal, there's also huge variability if you can use spoken language and go into a general ed classroom. So what do you think? Bullied? Yeah. So his mom also reports that he's bullied at school. He seems to be more aware of it, maybe because mom has talked about it. And he has some strategies, but they're not very effective, right? So if someone's bullying you, telling you to do stuff, you probably shouldn't go with them, right? All right, so that's there's a huge range in how kids perceive their situations, but we don't always ask kids. Most researchers don't ask kids, and they don't see kids in schools who do social skills research. So we ask kids, we use a friendship survey, so we ask all kids in the class about who hangs out with whom, who their best friends are, kids they like to hang out with, kids they don't really like to hang out with. That one question people don't like. But kids are fine with it, right? And you would be fine if I said to you, so you work in a big group, so are there people you like to hang out with at work? Yeah, maybe, maybe. Are there people you don't want to hang out with from work? Yeah, right? We all get that. It doesn't mean we hate them. It's just that we hang out with some people and we don't hang out with some people. So we ask kids these questions. They're totally fine with it. But this information is really important because if you get the whole, they don't even have to remember all the kids in their class. You get the whole class reporting on it, and you can develop maps from it. But you also, from those maps, you get a lot of information. How connected this child is to other kids in the class and how popular their particular group is. If children nominate someone as a best friend, do they get nominated back by that person? So there's reciprocity. How many children they nominate as friends and how many children nominate them as a friend. And so what you get are these little maps. And so you can tell from, so when we show teachers a map, if we showed teachers, they usually say, oh yeah, that's my class, right? So they know who hangs out with whom. We know that, so the parentheses behind the name tells us how many different kids nominated that kid to that group. We can tell how salient that group is or how popular that group is. So in this class, we have 2 kids, Nicholas and Nolan, who are isolated. They're isolated because they weren't nominated consistently to any group. Neither of those kids have autism. Sam has autism, the little kid in red, and he's connected to Ella. So he's typical of what we typically find, which is that our kids with autism are peripheral or just hanging on to one kid or to kind of on the margins of a group. And I've done this now in thousands of typical kids and about 300 to 400 kids with autism in lots of classrooms. And we get this very consistent finding over and over, which is that some of our kids are popular, so that's nuclear. Not very many are isolated, but the majority of them, so it's a lighter bar, are kids with autism, are peripheral. Right? So that's surprising in some ways because, you know, you would think from what you read and from what you hear, our kids are going to be isolated. Our kids are going to be rejected. We've done this so many times now, and they're never more rejected than, you know, other kids. So that's interesting. They may be more neglected or overlooked than they are actively rejected. So what we also know is that nearly all young kids, elementary school kids, can identify a friend or a best friend in class. So over 90% of the kids. But this really drops as kids get older. So as we get to young adulthood, it's more like 50% of the individuals can identify a friend. Reciprocity is limited. You know, so if I like Wendy and Wendy likes me, we have a reciprocal friendship, right? So for kids with ASD, it's about 20 to 34% of the samples of the studies I've done. And it's 60% for typical kids. So are you surprised by that? It's not 100%. So within that class, only 60% are reciprocated. All right, when we watch kids on the playground, we find that about a third of the observed playground time, they're interacting with kids. The rest of the time, they're either solitary or they're in lower levels of engagement, like parallel play. And children who are engaged with other kids initiate and respond more. Okay, that seems to make perfect sense, right? So one of the things about going to schools and seeing kids is that you need to gather information from lots of different sources. If we only gathered information from one source, we'd get kind of a skewed picture. So it's important to ask the kids in the class, the peers. It's important to ask the kid with autism. It's important to watch them on the playground and to get teacher report and parent report. So what we know about kids on the playground is that it's just a really tough environment, worse than the classroom, right? So children are often observed to self-isolate at school. They're the kids that are on the corner of the yard. They're reading on the yard. They're going to the library or the computer lab during recess rather than playing games. And they actually rarely might, you know, engage with other kids in games. So how do you intervene on this in a school setting? All right. So we did a study a few years ago now, 60 high-functioning kids. They were first through fifth graders, 30 different schools in LAUSD. I had an NIH grant, a little grant, and this was when gas went up to, I think it was $4. This was the first time it went up to $4 a gallon, and we were driving 500 miles a week. And my grant did not cover all of the gas that we needed to spend. That was bad. So anyway, we did a short-term interventions, 6 weeks, 12 sessions, so twice a week for 6 weeks. Again, short-term. And we did a 2-by-2 design. So we were interested, if we just intervene with the typical peers in the kids' classroom, so we would select 3 peers, would that be more effective than if we did, had the adult work directly on skills with the child with autism? Or we could combine those two, or we could just look at the control condition, which is inclusion. So it was a 4-by-4. All right, so we compared a child-assisted approach and a peer-mediated approach. And it was modular and individualized. So when we did a child-assisted, we had the adult who observed the child on the playground. They got teacher reports, peer networks, self-reports. We figured out what the top 3 problems were for that kid, and we worked on those problems one at a time. I hypothesized this is going to be the creme de la creme. We know what's going on at school. We can fix the problem, right? The peer-mediated, which is very successful with preschool kids, I thought, I'm unsure about elementary school. But we found 3 peers willing from the class. We had the peers identify some kids who had difficulty on the playground. We were not allowed to identify the child with autism, so we had to talk in circles. And we had the peers generate ideas to help engage all kids on the playground. So fairly indirect. What did we find? Of course, we always find what I don't hypothesize, always, in every study I've ever done. Peer-mediated interventions were far superior to anything just involving the child. So our primary outcome was those social networks. So we wanted to move kids from being more peripheral to being more engaged in that network. And what we found was that the peer-mediated, either the combination one or the peer, was superior to child with the adult or inclusion. That was no difference between those two. And then it maintained over a 3-month follow-up. It went down a little bit, but it didn't, surprisingly, maintained. And so you can see here in this map, we have this little girl was isolated at the beginning. 6 weeks later, she's connected to a group. She got the peer-mediated intervention. And we come back in 3 months, and she's still connected to a group. And you can see how these groups kind of change over time. This is nice, see? Only have 2 big groups in that little classroom over the course of 1 school year. All right. So other findings also favored the peer-mediated intervention. The number of received friend nominations was improved for those kids in that condition. They were less isolated on the playground, not more engaged, but less isolated. And the teachers rated their social skills in the classroom as being higher. And teachers didn't even know which condition they were randomized to because we were told we could do this study in the schools if we didn't involve any of their staff. So that was a little surprising to us. So what did we learn? We learned that teaching peers about engaging all the children makes the biggest difference, that children who have reciprocated friendships were not more engaged on the playground, right? So we didn't improve engagement, we only improved isolation. About 60% of the kids in this study had a one-on-one aid, either provided by the district or by an outside agency. We let that vary because we had no control over that. And those kids looked worse. So the kids that had the one-on-one aid were not engaged with other kids on the playground, nor were they involved with the aid. So that was not necessarily a good condition or situation. So the playground is pretty tough, and it probably needs a very specific intervention. So the next study we did, we actually conducted it on the playgrounds, whereas this study I just talked about wasn't done on the playground. It was at school, but not on the playground. So one of the things we thought about was that maybe kids are having so kids who have a reciprocated friend or a friend in the class are going out to the playground and they're not more engaged with their friends. Why is that? So one issue may be in that transition from school to playground. Playgrounds are booming, buzzing, crazy places. And you can imagine a child goes out on the playground and they've lost any connection to kids that they might know. So one notion is to try to get them to transition with purpose. So this is at our lab school. This is a teacher telling 2 little guys. So we did a study where we taught paraprofessionals on the playground, you know, those adults that stand around and watch the kids for safety. We taught them how to engage kids in games. And what happens when you do that is that the kids look better. They're more engaged during recess. So the top line is the immediate treatment, and the dotted line are the aides and the kids who waited. All right? And it maintains also short term. Other things that we've done, so now I'm almost at the end, and I'm just going to give you some of the material. So we have a lot of materials, right? You're working in schools, you've got to have materials, you've got to give people something that they can hold and to do, otherwise, you know, it just doesn't work. So we, this is an actual class, this is a school where we have the aide just going in and, or the interventionist going in and doing a little bit of prompting. All right. The other thing that we've done, and this is where the neurotypical kids love these social menus. So we give out social menus. The kids all it's like an icebreaker. You'd be amazed at how our kids with autism are isolating themselves at lunchtime. They sit on the edge of the table. They don't talk with anybody. And these different little social menus really, break the ice, I guess, give them something to talk about. I don't know if this will work. Let's see. Oh, you don't need to see that. Okay, we'll just finish. And so we have materials that we give our aides along with the social menus. Okay, so interventions, I think, in summary, then need to focus on core deficits of social communication and, of course, behavior regulation. Engagement is this essential intervention target, and it incorporates several different developmental skills that target these core deficits in ASD. So it's really important to keep kids engaged. And that engagement, at school with peer interactions is both positive and negative. So sometimes we protect the kids from having any kind of negative interactions, and yet that's how we all learn to deal with conflict. It's how you learn more intimate relationships. So within limits, kids need to have some negative or some conflict as well. And then there's strong empirical support for combining behavioral and developmental interventions that are targeted on these core deficits, so the content of our interventions. Promise, interventions do work for the majority of kids with autism when we deliver it by autism experts and with intensity. But teachers who may not have ASD expertise can learn the interventions. Those clearly were simple interventions. They can get good results because they provide more consistency and greater intensity over the course of the year. They have regular contact with kids. The thing about having regular contact is that they know when things need to change, when they either need to change something about the intervention, increase the intensity, or something else. And so we need to give them, more power to do interventions and also more information about interventions. Thank you.